Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is Gabriel. Now I have to get a few things out of the way immediately for this video. First of all, Gabriel was a slave, and generally slaves took their master's last name. Now there is no record of Gabriel ever referring to himself, or generally at the time being referred to as Gabriel Prosser. But he was kind of given the surname Prosser by historians to distinguish himself from the dozens of other Gabriels throughout American history, world history, biblical history. Although today I will just be referring to him as Gabriel, though I will note you might see him as Gabriel Prosser in certain texts. Additionally, Gabriel had a rebellion, as you can see right here, and that's what we'll be discussing today. Gabriel's rebellion was done with the best of intentions, although the results may not have been what he desired, and we will get into that, but I want to note right off the bat that I do applaud his intentions, not just to liberate himself and run away from slavery, but to take the time and effort and spend months planning a rebellion, trying to liberate all the slaves in the state of Virginia. So let's talk about his story. Gabriel was born sometime about when the American Revolution was beginning, the actual Revolutionary War. 25 years later, he was working in Virginia, and he grew up on a plantation and learned to be a blacksmith. Our modern recollection, generally speaking, when we think of plantation work, we usually just think about slaves being out in the fields. But the truth is, slaves held most manual labor positions throughout certain societies and certain states during the end of the Revolution. And right now we're talking about the year 1800, which is the last year of John Adams' presidency, and right when Thomas Jefferson is running to replace him as president, just to put some context. So, the Revolutionary War is over here, but the American founding is still largely underway. So Gabriel worked as a blacksmith, as I said, and he would be loaned out to different businesses by his master on occasion, which was very common at the time. Masters would loan their slaves out for a variety of reasons, mostly to add extra income to their plantation. Now, Gabriel was fortunate in the fact that he was able to read. He did learn to read. So when he was loaned out to different places, he would mingle with, for lack of a better term, free white laborers. And because of not just his education he received in literacy, but because he was extraordinarily intelligent, he was able to pick up on the nuances when people were discussing the American Revolution and freedom, and when word arrived of the successful rebellion down in Haiti led by Toussaint Louverture. Because of this, Gabriel got the idea that, hey, maybe we should have a certain rebellion here in Virginia. And he spent the spring and summer of 1780 planning a rebellion, and actually set a date of August 30th, 1800 to carry out his task. And the idea was they were going to take the then capital of Virginia, Richmond. They were going to storm the capital, take the state governor, and hold the governor hostage until the slaves in Virginia were liberated. Now, just to put some context in this, the governor at the time was future President James Monroe, and that's who they were planning to kidnap and hold until, again, as I said, the slaves in Virginia were liberated. Now, interestingly, this wasn't just Gabriel by himself. He put together a coalition of slaves, free black people in Virginia who were probably taking the biggest risk, and even many white men who were hoping to also end the horrid practice of slavery on the soil of Virginia. Now, the date of August 30th comes, and there's a storm, and they decide to postpone the rebellion. And this seems to be their undoing, because while people are waiting, at this point, because many slaves were already involved, many of the slave owners started to kind of suspect something was going on, and one of the slaves did admit to their master that it was being led by Gabriel. And this is why the rebellion never actually takes place. Instead, James Monroe, who clearly doesn't want to be kidnapped, say what you will about him owning slaves, in general, he just didn't want to be kidnapped, as most of us don't. So he calls out the militia to prevent this and to go arrest Gabriel and several other co-conspirators of his. Now, Gabriel runs away and gets to Norfolk and is ready to board a ship and flee. He's going to make it to safety, at least himself. But unfortunately, a reward of $300 was put on his head. And now, $300 at the time was a significant amount of money, especially for a slave who, over the course of their life, would generally make $0. So, as he's getting on the boat, another slave recognizes him and sells him out. Now, it's hard to, it's hard not to make that gentleman a bad guy in this story. Although, again, this person was a slave and was just trying to preserve themselves. Unfortunately for them, that $300 they were promised, they only got $50 of because they were a slave and slaves were treated like garbage, which is a sad, sad fact that Gabriel was trying to end. And I admire his goals, as I said before. Now, Gabriel was brought back, given a secret trial with 25 other people, 2 of whom were his brothers, and all 26 of them were hung for conspiring to commit treason and kidnap the governor. It's a sad end to what in many people's eyes could be looked at as an heroic attempt to end slavery in Virginia. The sad truth about Gabriel's rebellion is it ends up making slavery in Virginia and several other southern states significantly worse. You see, while the plantation owners were very much concerned about making money and wanted to make as much money as they could, and many of them considered slavery reprehensible at the time, they didn't know how to go about removing it from society, especially because their biggest fear was not losing money, but slave rebellions. And in a fashion, Gabriel's rebellion confirmed many existing fears of southern plantation owners that, should slaves be left up to their own devices, they would rebel, and it would be quite literally their heads on the line. As a result of Gabriel's rebellion, Virginia passes several new laws, which are much more repressive to slaves. For example, they pass a law that slaves can no longer be loaned out to businesses by their masters, which, as I said, this is a time where, because centuries of cash cropping on Virginia soil, mostly tobacco, but many other crops, over and over again over the years, the soil of Virginia was essentially destroyed. And they were growing a minute amount of what they used to grow to sell on the market. So loading out their slaves was a substantial portion of a plantation owner's income. But they were willing to sacrifice that income to prevent slaves from being loaned out, which would, in effect, prevent them from meeting not only other slaves, but white people who were clearly being too cool about things and telling them about freedom and the successful rebellions overseas and such. So they took that economic hit in order to prevent that opportunity from happening. Furthermore, slaves were now no longer permitted to become literate. See, at the time, literacy rates were extraordinarily high throughout the American states. The reason for this is you had to read the Bible, and even slaves were told they should be reading the Bible. Though granted, after this, Mass could not be held on Sundays without a white person present to make sure they weren't planning rebellion. Furthermore, all free black people, because there were free black people in all the states at this point, and all the free black people in Virginia were told to get out. Now, they could petition to remain, but this was a long and arduous process that didn't necessarily end in being successfully permitted to stay. Interesting side note, several of the wealthy black people owned their own slaves in Virginia at the time and other states. Notably, James Armistead Lafayette, for example, who lived outside Virginia at this time, and now that I'm saying it, was probably one of the people who petitioned to remain. Either way, because he was there when Lafayette came back, but that's a different story. See my James Armistead Lafayette video, if you like. Furthermore, so at this point, Gabriel's rebellion essentially backfired. Because his attempt to liberate all these slaves, Virginia's policy regarding slaves became extraordinarily tighter. Again, at a time when people were trying to figure out a way to eliminate the terrible practice, though also at a time where Eli Whitney's new cotton gin was making slavery a much more profitable enterprise. that's the story of Gabriel's rebellion. It's not the most fun video to talk about, but it's an extraordinarily important video to talk about because it puts a large perspective on how slaves were viewed by them from their own point of view and from the point of view of their masters during this time of transition when the United States itself is just getting off the ground. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Before I go, I did forget to mention one thing. When Gabriel was planning out his rebellion, he actually said during the plans that should violence break out in the city, no Methodists, Quakers, or French people should be harmed by the rebels, because Methodists and Quakers at this point were against slavery for spiritual and religious reasons. And they, in addition to French people, because this is a decade after the French Revolution where everyone was set free, they had already been going out of their way, despite being usually wealthy white people, had been going out of their way to try and convince plantation owners to manumit their slaves on their own without the interference of the state, just because it was the right thing to do. And I didn't want to forget that. It wasn't just going to be a slave revolt. As we said, the fears were that the slaves were going to revolt and just kill all the white people. No, the slaves were revolting and only attacking the white people who were not being reasonable about it. The white people who had been going out of their way to try and abolish slavery, they were not going to be attacked because Gabriel was a very intelligent person, and this revolt was not just violent for violence sake. It was very specifically to eliminate an institution and very specifically to kidnap future President James Monroe. So again, if you like this video, please give me a like. If you're new here, definitely subscribe. If you don't like the fact that the slaves were being held as slaves, that doesn't mean you should hit thumbs down below. That means you won't see any more of my videos, and it looks bad for me. So even if you don't like the idea of slavery, still hit a thumbs up, because that can help me produce more content like this where we can help educate people about our American past. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with our live trivia event tomorrow, Friday at 8:15 Eastern. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow.